Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our last session. We're not about to have dancing girls and cocktails despite the lowering of the lights. This is to give a more intimate experience for the conversation that we're about to have. The subject of this afternoon's interview is probably one of the best known faces in our industry and has been so for 45 years and is now coming to that stage of life where we believe he's going to retire. I'm talking, of course, about Alistair Robert McBriar Campbell, who joined Blackwell's directly from university in 1968 and progressing through to becoming president of Blackwell Publishing in 2001. And after the Wiley acquisition of Blackwell, became senior publisher there, a job he still retains. And he's held virtually all of the important posts in our industry, chairman of Adonis, chairman of STM, chairman of INASP, chairman of Crossref and the Publishing Research Consortium, and has twice served on the Council of the PA. But Bob, before we start our conversation, I think you wanted to have a picture taken.
You may remember that Harold Varmus sat here about 5 years ago and told us we wouldn't be here in 3 years' time. So what we're going to do is we want a photograph of you all waving.
Yes.
And I will send
Hello, Harold.
And I'll send it to Harold to say we're still here. Great, come on. That's fantastic. Thank you.
So, Bob, I think that's actually rather typical of your approach to publishing, isn't it? Can you tell us a bit about your family background? I understand that you're head of Clan Campbell.
No, not really. It's interesting. When Ronnie Williams first took over as CEO of the Publishers Association, he came to see us, and his first question was, why did you change your name from MacArthur to Campbell in the 13th century? And I thought, Jesus, this is knowledge. This is a real trade. And the answer is, everybody was called MacArthur in the 13th century. It meant son of somebody who was illegitimate. Arthur is a name you gave to illegitimate boys, and then MacArthur is the son of the illegitimate boy. And so we thought we could clean up our act, so took on the name Campbell. And the original Campbell was buried in 1296, just near where we have a cottage. And our family's from the second of his three brothers, so we're actually called Inverall. And but we're split, and since a rift where my ancestor elder brother didn't actually get married, but his housekeeper had kids called Mrs. Fish. And that side of the family claims they're head of the family, and my side, of course, claims we're head of the family. So about 18 years ago, the elders in the family tried to mend this rift by arranged marriage between the eldest son of the other side and our youngest daughter. And this is, I'm talking about, current times, serious negotiations over arranged marriage. And when our daughter discovered, she said she'd report us to the police if there was any more of this. So the rift continues. These things go on in the West Highlands.
So is that in fact the Campbell Tarn?
This is actually a family north of us, not Inverall. And but I was actually brought up near Oxford in a very isolated old farmhouse, no electricity till I was 13, and then left school quite young, worked in the Radcliffe as a heart technician, did vivisections, so I was the anaesthetist, and then I went to work on farms in France, so eventually got to university in Aberdeen, and then as Michael said, I went straight into publishing.
So your father was an ornithologist and writer. I mean, did this stimulate you to study biology?
Sort of. It's not great fun being brought up by an ornithologist because they're pretty obsessed, and we'd be driving along sometimes, the car would just stop, and Dad would run out with his binoculars, and we were just left there, for half an hour while he was running after the bird that he'd spotted. So, my uncle was more of an influence. He was a fish biologist, and so I used to fish a lot, and I still meet regularly with my cousin, his son, and we discuss the latest research in salmonid biology. But I did co-authored a couple of books on birds with my father when he was getting older.
And did you ever consider a career as an academic? I mean, you've been given an honorary degree recently.
I was the only PhD offer was to work on rooks, but I was getting married on leaving university, and my wife wouldn't have taken living in a village north of Aberdeen for 3 years. It's a shame because I've now become quite interested in corvids, and I feel I would have liked to have understood them better.
So how did you get into publishing? Did you know you always wanted to be one?
Yeah, well, not really. I hadn't really thought much about the future, but my parents were authors, and so we had publishers visiting regularly, so I sort of knew them. And it was either that or I was shortlisted. I was a racing correspondent for a year, Mako Newbury, and so I had to decide whether to be the racing correspondent of the Country Life or get a job in publishing. And thankfully, I chose publishing because I think it would have been very boring being a racing correspondent.
I understand there was a certain amount of family advantage that was exercised.
Oh, yes. In those days, yes, Pierre Saugman was running Blackwell Scientific Publications, it was called then. And I think he just took me on because of my father, people my father knew. So it was nepotism was pretty common then, as still is now.
And Per Saugman is somebody who has quite a reputation for, along with Paul Rosebald.
Yes, I was very lucky to work for him, and he was originally a bookseller. He absolutely understood the book business. Never really so much a journal publisher, but he built up a very successful business, and he and the chairman, Richard Blackwell, were incredibly patient with me because I took a while to sort of get going. We also didn't really, journals were second-class, second-tier business, so I did start 2 journals when I was 24, and when I did a 5-year plan for the board and showed this pathetic growth of books with suddenly a little hockey stick at the end, and then I showed a second graph showing what if I had journals, and it was much better, and it went like that. The Blackwell family said, "Oh, well, that's cheating, journals. No, just keep to books." So we weren't that active in the 70s launching journals. We took a few society journals on if they came to us. But
so Per Saugman, you would say, was more of a books guy?
Definitely, yes.
Yeah. But he's brought this European tradition of journal publishing with him as well?
The influence was Olaf Muller, who, I don't know if you remember him, he ran Munksgaard, which was owned by Blackwell, and he was a very lively publishing brain, and he was the one that really was thinking about journals and would be phoning up Pierre with his latest ideas. And both of them were active in the STM Association, and very active. And Pierre became chairman in the late 70s. So I was brought on as chaired something called the Innovations Committee, which did very little. But it did mean that I sat on the board of STM. I was about the youngest by about 30 years, I think. And it was a pretty extraordinary organization then. You get all these old publisher owners, about half would be asleep, and Paul Asser would talk and talk and talk. But we started the original journal publishing course then in '78, which was quite successful with Gillian Page. And I did a few things, and Pierre was chairman.
So these days of journal publishing, I mean, we often hear about the North Holland model, and we get Paul Rosebald introducing similar ideas into Pergamon. Was that current at the time and something that...
No, we were pretty isolated because largely it was a book culture. And then I landed up chairing Adonis, which Pierre called the most expensive dining club in Europe. This was a consortium of the big publishers to deliver journal articles from a jukebox of compact discs and charge a sort of price that would bring back a royalty to the publishers, and it was to outcompete photocopying, which was actually document delivery by photocopying was a major business then, but very inefficient. Estimates of overheads of sort of $15, $18 a pop, so we could undercut it. That was the theory of Adonis. It didn't really work out, but what we learned from its failure was that politically it was all wrong, and that was a lesson we took through to when we launched Crossref, that you had to have a much wider political base, a good representation of not-for-profits, and so there was a lesson there from the demise of Adonis.
In talking to other people about you, it's not long before the phrase Oxford Poker School crops up. What can you tell us about this institution?
Yes, well, I played poker at university for a year and a lot. And now thinking back, the amount of time one wastes as a student doing something like that. But then in Oxford, the poker school really started at OUP with Simon Ratton and Ivan Asquith and Richard Charkin and John Conybeare. And I was a sort of add-on from Blackwell, and there were 2 or 3 others. But it still plays regularly every month or two. So it's been going for about 35 years, and still got a publishing base, playing in 2 weeks' time. And now there's actually 3 players from Wiley, and I think just 1 from OUP. So the balance has changed, and Ivan Asquith still plays.
But there was a time when this was virtually like an informal STM subcommittee.
There was a lot of chat in those days, yes, with Mike Boswood and Richard and Ivan and co. Yes, there was quite a lot of inside chat on the industry, which was helpful. But I mean, I think I learned more from Adonis, because chairing that board with people like Otto Tahar and Dietrich Goetz and Klaus Michaelitz and co. on that board, we learned a huge amount that we just didn't know about in Oxford, and that's really accelerated us in the 80s. Plus the fact there was this panic of that the electronic journal, whatever that was going to be, was going to replace the journal that we knew. So I think it's fair to say a number of our competitors held back when they could have been growing in the 80s. We took the reverse and went all out for growth in the 80s and managed to move up to the sort of what I called onto the high table. So when the change came, my argument was that we'd have enough titles there to be able to sit on the high table and be involved in policy.
Now, you mentioned earlier about serving through the Innovations Committee on the
yes.
STM board. I mean, can you remember when you became an elected board member as opposed to just the head of a committee, and how that turned into becoming chairman eventually?
I don't know how the process worked in those days. I guess Dietrich and Lex decided they should finger me next, and that was it. And I was sent. I represented with Steve Hall the publishing community on what proved to be a very important day in Brussels when they were first drafting the copyright directive in '98, and that was the sort of first experience of lobbying when policy was being developed. And curiously, I now sit next to Steve Hall on the Finch Committee, doing much the same thing many years later. So I don't know if Steve's around here, but so it's. But later on with Finch, of course, we had tremendous support from the trade associations, and Graham Taylor was instrumental behind the scenes in setting up Finch with this very unusual balance of stakeholders, where we got 3 publishers represented and 3 societies out of 12. So that was a lesson on what, I mean, the sessions this morning was very interesting on communication and conversation. Well, I mean, I think all that was a very effective session. There's a lot about what we have to do now, and Finch was a marvelous example of where we got into conversation with policymakers. We got to know them quite well, and now I think we have weekly communication with BIS, our Business Innovation Skills Department, providing them information, providing information for speeches. So the relationship's completely different from 5 years ago, and everything was said this morning that we've got to really hammer that, and this is where the trade associations give us the backbone. And
going back to your time as chairman, I mean, there are lots of things that happened during
yes.
that. I mean, looking back on it now, what would you see as the legacies of
well,
your
we
period?
started the masterclass to pick up the sort of level above the journal class and the journal course, and John Jarvis was also backed that, and people got to know their peers in other companies on the journal course and liked that, and some of them kept in touch with those contacts. So we thought we'd sort of revisit that at a higher level. So it's partly the importance of masterclass was the other people on the course, and as you know, it's been a struggle sometimes to get the necessary sort of critical mass, it really is better to be about 20, 25 people on that course. On most occasions that's been achieved, and I think it's great to see that still moving along. The other thing we did sort of came out of STM was that it was a sort of cradle for Crossref. It was where people got to know each other, and so when an idea like that popped up, you had already a community ready to do something together. They knew each other well enough, even though they were competitors, to get round a table and back Ed Pence and the management team, and that's been a great success story. So I think it's one of the great achievements of STM. I think STM can claim to be success has many fathers, and certainly Crossref's got many fathers, but STM's certainly there as the cradle for what happened.
Now, you've always been very keen on publishing philanthropy and been involved in INASP. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, INASP, I got bounced into that by Sir Roger Elliott. Carol Priestley had built it up. A very able woman, but it reached a stage where it really needed new management, and so I chaired it for about 6 years, and it was quite difficult times to get the right management in place. The staff are brilliant, but now, thankfully, with the new trustees, they brought in Sue Corbett, who was an ex-colleague, and my colleague David Nicholson's been a trustee. Ian Russell helped a lot as a trustee, and that's now running very well. I mean, I think the staff have now got the management they deserve, and the important work they're doing, it's not just making journal content free or virtually free, it's all the training you need to do around it. And that's where INASP is so strong. The network of trainers, particularly in Africa, has ensured that our journals, when they get switched on, they actually get used.
So INASP is funded somewhat differently to some of the other initiatives.
Yeah, it has to.
A government grant.
It has to present plans to funders around mainly Northern Europe, and really earn its corn. It has to show that it's going to make a difference. Very successful program for authors as well, to encourage authorship from developing countries. And again, we had to go around and find funders for that. But it's pretty stable. It's the long-term funding is quite strong, and it's, I think, it's not as well known as Research for Life, but it's in the developing world, it's certainly well known. And
you see the two programs as complementary?
Oh yes, definitely. Yeah. Yes. They do seem to work together very, very well. Yes.
I mean, when you're talking with colleagues at INASP, what do you see as is there a reaction to perhaps these programs become unnecessary in an open access future?
Well, yes, and I don't think INASP is not particularly wedded to any model. So as they see migration to open access, they will presumably be able to win grants to help those communities use open access journals. As I said, it doesn't really matter whether how it's free. It's how they use it and the training and the kit necessary to use that access. So they can easily move from one model to another. And given the mood of major funders, I think they're probably very happy to fund help in training moving to the open access model. Now,
you talked about your time at Crossref, or you referred to it earlier.
Yes.
I mean, that's something that's gone from strength to strength.
Yes. It's I think it's probably more important now than ever, and it's been a really interesting approach where we managed to bring together a range of stakeholders who and the board, which is represents all those views. We have open access publishers on the board, and Ed somehow, as well as being brilliant at selecting staff and bringing on managers and all the technology, he also steers a very careful path politically, staying neutral, and that's meant that we've not run into what we could have easily run into the trap of being seen as just an arm of big global players and got a sort of fairly negative reaction, but we managed to avoid that. And now, as you've seen from, for example, Cora's presentation, it's going to be instrumental in perhaps another major move for publishers.
Yes, I think it's one of those things that we can't all realise what we did before we invented it.
That's right, yes.
Now, you mentioned earlier about the Finch process, but I mean, you and I have been working together for more years than I care to remember on public access and other issues. I mean, this all started off with the House of Commons Select Committee inquiry.
Yes.
The older one in 2004. I'm not referring to the ones that have happened more recently. And that itself was an interesting process, I think.
That was absolutely crucial time. We were so unprepared when that came up. We had no evidence. We just went in there really on a wing and a prayer. And we realized after that we really had to get our act together. So one of the things we did was to start the Publishing Research Consortium, PRC, where the various trade associations got together, jointly funded a program, and that started to provide the evidence. And I think it was very satisfying to see when the stakeholder committee that Fred Diller was involved in and John Vaughan in the States, when you read their paper, how many references there were to PRC research, and it just showed how much we'd achieved in a matter of 3 or 4 years. And I've come off that PRC, but it's I hope the trade associations continue to support it. But so the difference was also, one, we didn't have evidence, we realized, and secondly, we'd never done any of the things that were talked about this morning. We just didn't know MPs, and we didn't know senior civil servants, and we moved pretty quickly. So by the time the report was debated, I think it was 15th of December 2005 in Westminster Hall, it was completely different. Elsevier had, Crispin Davis had talked and got to know Lord Sainsbury, who was the minister in charge of what we now call BIS. We had conversations, I think Alicia and others at Elsevier, Nick Fowler had talked to other MPs. At Wiley, Blackwell, we had talked to another crucial MP. So the debate was fantastic. We actually had, for the contrast between 2004 and end of 2005 was incredible. And that was very encouraging, and I think we've kept up that momentum. And then with recent developments, with Finch, I think we've stepped it up yet further. And some of us now have pretty good close contact with policymakers. And the next step is, of course, funders who are very suspicious about publishers. So that's going to be another long haul. But I see that in the next 5 years, there's a lot more work to be done. I think that's only just started. You know, we saw this very damaging statement from Science Europe. We saw a much more balanced statement from the Global Research Council. And again, we've seen one select committee in the UK, fairly publisher-friendly, aware of the dangers of short embargoes, which the Minister, Willits, is very aware of. And then we saw the BISCOM report advocating short embargoes and anti the hybrid model. So it's a pretty chaotic scene this is where the industry's still got to work together and probably put more in than ever to push our case and to make sure we're on every table that's there.
Yeah, I think my reaction to the Select Committee inquiry in 2004 was, I think we rather naively thought that inquiries were about finding things out. And the reality was that the chair of that inquiry,
Ian Gibson,
Gibson, who later lost his seat through fraudulent activity.
That's right.
Although I don't think that was connected, I hasten to add. He had already decided what the answers were going to be before any of the questions had been asked. And I think that was really quite a shock to us. I think we're all brought up in a world of peer review and scientists where A follows B follows C. And the fact that this whole thing had been effectively engineered by one MP,
it certainly felt like that.
It was certainly very. And of course, this is one of the reasons why Bob wants to send a picture to Harold Varmus, because those who attended these sessions will remember that Varmus stood up before the committee and told them it could all be done for $50.
Yes,
as I recall.
that's right. Yes.
So it'd be quite nice to have a tape of that and play it back to him at some point. Going into that, though, I think we, as publishers, we went in with very, very different views to what we have now. I mean, I think that the issue then was, oh God, we're not sure we like any of this open access business. Let's put a stop to it.
Yeah.
And perhaps tactically, if we'd thought this through, this was not such a good choice.
No, that's true. I think apart from Springer realizing the potential and investing in Biomed Central, so the main publishers, they got there perhaps ahead of the rest of us. But you're right, we were still, so that debate in December 2005, we were still questioning the model, open access, particularly gold open access model. And
it's probably worth saying for those that don't remember this as well, that actually what was being proposed was open access publishing rather than this nuanced gold and green that we talk about so much now. And of course, it was Gibson who brought the green repository model out of the hat.
Rabbit out of the hat was yes, and yes, and I think still, with that past, it's quite difficult. Still difficult to handle the debate, but I think Finch, we've got there. We went in there. Janet Finch said, right, this is a mixed economy. We're not discussing which model is better than the other, or in the long term, gold is the most effective model for wider access. But in the terms of what we're discussing, we're talking about a mixed economy, and I think that was really the basis of the success of that group, was that she cut out a lot of waste time and debate, which we saw then reappear in the BISCOM inquiry and report, which came more recently, where they just went back 10 years to the earlier debate, which and we saw the influence of other parties there that we hadn't with the House of Lords Committee.
And you must have felt as a Finch Committee member the period after the report came out and the obfuscation and general unhelpfulness of RC UK. That must have been very frustrating.
Yes, it was, but we I think we're fairly confident that David Willits understood the importance of sustainable quality publishing, and there were one or two follow-up meetings with him where he was rock solid that a short embargo was not a sustainable position, and so I think and we were witness to meetings where he was pretty firm with the RC UK representatives on what they should be doing. So there was a sort of pincer movement from above, from David Willits and his group, and from outside, from the House of Lords, who came in with a very, very solid recommendation that the Finch principles that the government accepted should be followed more effectively by
and it's worth saying that one of the most important and instrumental objects that were used in this was in fact the flowchart that is called the PA flowchart, but I have a feeling it was someone else who...
Well, actually, I think it was David Green. It was Taylor and Francis actually drafted that, or Ian Bannerman. They sat down and said, what does this text mean? And somehow encapsulated in a tree. There was a week when RC UK produced a different tree, quite a big bushy tree, and we had numerous emails back and forwards trying to slim it back down to the original tree. And we would prefer to call it just the decision tree. It's not terribly helpful, I think, that it's still being called the Publishers Association or the PA tree, and we're dealing with that issue today. Just as, I mean, there's a lot of this language is important. Another one that we feel strongly about is calling the acronym APC. It should be article publication charge and not article processing charge, and we're forever suggesting getting that straight in various documents.
Yes, in fact, you can almost judge the provenance of a document as to which of those two it uses.
It's a marker.
It's a marker.
Yes.
I think that the thing that I felt when the Royal Society meeting happened a year or so ago, I think when Willits turned up at that, held up the decision tree and said, "This is government policy."
Yes.
I think that was quite a sweet moment actually for a lot of us.
Yeah, he's still very solid. He's going to China next week and intends to talk to policymakers along the lines of Finch, and he will continue to talk to his counterparts and try and persuade them to adopt the Finch approach.
So in terms of the wider policy dimension at your time at Blackwell's and after, you were obviously instrumental in getting Blackwell's to start think about the choice programme, but also in terms of how you think about green open access. And I wonder how your thoughts have been moving in that direction.
Well, I can't say we were a front runner, but we obviously followed open access closely. We adopted the hybrid model pretty early on, and now have it. And I think 81% of our titles offer the hybrid option, and that's picked up very well this year, as I guess it has for all of us. But it's also been quite stimulating for publishers to have this new option of launching Gold OA journals, and we've launched a number, and it's been fun to see those do really well. I was brought up in times when you lost horrendous amounts of money for about 5 years, and then started clawing it back and hoped to break even about year 7, year 8. And now to see some of these open access journals running into the black within a year, it's incredible, and it's quite exciting. And it's a mixture of adopting a new model and the old values. It's finding the right editor. So some of those skills are there that have come through from the subscription-based publishing, and our most successful gold titles definitely relate to the fact we've got those ones with the strongest editors.
Perhaps at this point we can take a few questions or observations from the floor. I don't know if anybody has a burning question they'd like to ask Bob. Fred. Wait for there's a microphone coming.
So Bob, a young person going to a newspaper reporter and asking, should I have a career in newspaper journalism, would probably have a dismal answer. What would you say to a young person inquiring about a career in scientific publishing?
Yeah, as a question, we get asked quite a bit, and as I've lived in Oxford most of my life, it's a bit like a village, and quite a few young people who ask, any chance of helping me into publishing. Our 3 children all write and work in related to publishing one way or another. So yes, I still think there's lots to do. I think there are fantastic opportunities, but what was interesting is when I look back, and I was allowed to start 2 journals in 1970 when I set them up when I was 24. Now, you couldn't really imagine that now, and yet it's so easy to set up a journal. I'm not sure anyone around here is allowing 24-year-olds wandering around the office launching new journals. And we used to lose thousands on these things too, to start with. So I think the companies aren't taking enough risks. They're not taking enough risks with younger people. They're not listening to, and again, that was one of the themes this morning, listen more, 2 ears and 1 mouth. We should be, I think, giving head to much a younger generation, and I think they will deliver. The obvious easy thing to do at the moment is to convert journals to gold only, where you've got the backing, often helped by a society in our case, and that is fun, and there's still scope for that. But also the complexity is fascinating. So there's lots of jobs in licensing and all the other related things. And you see, for example, I looked at the list of people going to the Alps dinner this evening. It's a whole range of different functions. It's not just a few publishing houses. There's a whole range of, and I'm sure in this room here, of things that feed into the publishing process. So I think there's lots to do, and I just hope that people let those young people get at it quickly, and rather than get stuck in. I think I spent some of my early life correcting proofs to reduce the amount of retypesetting in hot lead. I mean, that's what a lot of us did for a lot of our time. We adjusted the author's corrections to save money on the composition charges. I mean, the things we spent time on were incredible, and now you can actually spend time on getting stuff out quickly, and a lot of what we wasted our time with or spent a lot of time on, we don't have to do anymore. So I think it's a much purer publishing job now.
Mm-hmm. We've got another one at the back here, I think.
David Green, Taylor and Francis. Thanks for the name check, Bob. As you probably know, I've got quite a few ex-Blackwell Science colleagues that work with me. I'm thinking of one particularly, Graham Hobbs, who's our education editorial director. He tells a story about you that he repeats to new recruits into Taylor and Francis today, which is that when he started in 1978, you came along to him, waved a paper journal at him and said, I don't know why you're joining this industry, my boy. This is going to be dead in a few years. It's all going to be disseminated by computer, etc. So, hello, Harold Barmas. Hello, Bob Campbell. And what do you attribute this great resilience and longevity to, do you think, about the print journal and indeed the subscription/sales model? Because it seems to us that it's almost as strong as ever, despite all the upsurge of other models that we're all experimenting with.
It's a good question. I was sort of boasting to our new MP in Oxford, Nicola Blackwood, that we had managed the migration from print to digital while the music industry and the newspaper industry hadn't. And she said, oh, well, that's because they have to sell to individuals and you sell to institutions. I thought it was quite a sharp analysis from a young MP. And I think that may be part of your answer, David, that we've dealt with a completely different community. And when you think that the big deal came from, it didn't come from us, it came from our market, it came from Hefke, was concerned that there were no longer going to be high-quality peer-reviewed journals available for the university, for HEIs, because at that stage the prices were doing this and the circulation's doing that. And the future looked pretty grim in the early 90s. And they reacted to that, feeling that something had to be done to ensure sustainable publishing. And they funded the original trial of the big deal in the UK in 1995-96, just as we brought online delivery and platforms in. So the whole thing worked out beautifully for us. There's the case of an institution, or in there, our national funding body, actually seeing us through a very rough patch. And then when you think about after that, when we still had fairly dodgy technology, they stayed faithful to those journals and accepted the big deal. So our circulations went up from 500 to 5,000 to 10,000, thanks to the big deal and the way we traded with institutions. And they were looking after their faculty. They didn't want to be hit by complaints from faculty. They hadn't got a certain title available. Elements of the faculty still wanted print on paper. So they were really the conservative sustaining element, I think, in that transition. Problem now is that, of course, we haven't been that clever. All we've done is to change print to digital. We haven't actually changed the model that significantly, and that's still to come.
Is there another question at the back? Or at the front even? Jane.
Thank you. Jane Marks, Waters Clewer. Bob, you've been one of the leading lights in society publishing for many, many years. How do you see the future of our relationships with our society partners as their business model changes as fast as ours does?
Yes, well, Steve and I have tried to work very closely, Steve Hall and I, in combining with the societies in the UK to give us a wider base for lobbying. And also at Wiley we have worked very closely with our over 800 partners, keeping them in touch with these policy issues and the threat and opportunities of open access. So they are now pretty sensitive to what's happening and are being quite helpful. For example, with our latest problem and challenge in the UK is HEFGE is running a consultation over the idea of insisting that faculty have to, if they're going to submit an article for the assessment, it has to be open access. So they want to force open access to sort of 100% level. Some of the research that's being done to bring them back from that a bit has been done by humanities and social science societies. My colleague Philip Carpenter has been talking to the guy that's leading that with some collecting some quite good evidence, which I think is going to be listened to by HEFGE. Willits himself, whenever he talks about this, he mentions learned societies and their importance. The problem is we fail completely to get that understood in Brussels, because for the rest of Europe, outside the UK, societies tend to be rather different. They're more sort of smaller volunteer groups. They don't have big English language journals that can support a range of activities. So I don't think we've done a great job as yet. We've tried, every meeting we've tried to get over the importance of learned societies and how they've got to be taken through these changes. And we are launching new journals with learned societies and open access journals, and they're going very well. I mean, it's because the society then gives it some, that ensures the community is behind what is still, viewed sometimes with suspicion. But if it's backed by their society, it gives them more confidence to use that, the new journal that you launch. So the partnerships can be quite productive.
I hesitate to ask this question, but I did notice when preparing that when you were president of Blackwell's, you were quoted as saying, change is exciting.
Yeah.
Where do you think the next frontier is for us?
Well, I mean, I think it's why I've been managed to keep going so long, because it's always changing. When I think each decade what I did is completely different from the next decade. And the only successful prediction I made was, my wife found the article in 1979. We used to discuss the crossover point. I don't remember this. When would electronic journals be cheaper or the same cost as print on paper? And I wrote that this would be 1995, I predicted. And below me if that sort of happened. So, but otherwise, my predictions have been pretty hopeless. So I wouldn't, I think my answer to that is it's not my generation's going to find the answer, but I think the next decade we're going to see a tremendous rate of changes. It's very clear understanding with major technological change, you tend to overestimate what will happen in the near time, but possibly underestimate what's going to happen further away. And I suspect we are still underestimating what will happen, even though on a 5-year span basis, things seem fairly manageable. And there are tremendous opportunities for new publishers. You can now get into this game at a relatively low cost. So I think we could see more startups and trying different models. What is interesting is that at the moment, what is the base of our business really is peer review, and provided that sort of stays in place, quite a lot of what we do, I think, will stay in place. And this sort of idea of the internet, where the crowd decides and it's up to the user, post-publication peer review. It's interesting that hasn't happened, and PLOS has tried very hard to stimulate that, but it just hasn't happened. And so that is the sort of thing that's going to, if provided that stays in place and we continue to help the academic community manage peer review. When I started in publishing, I was told that journals weren't going to last because you couldn't find anyone to peer review the articles. So that was 1970, I was told that. And in fact, there was a paper published in a letter in Nature by 2 of our editors pointing out that just as Michael's been telling us now for some time, that this accusation that we are proliferating articles and stuff and over-publishing is simply not true. It's straight relationship, an extra 2 or 3, 4% articles a year, which is the same increase as the number of research workers per year. Steady straight line graph for more than decades, centuries. So they pointed out the number of course peer reviewers increases, and they just did the extrapolation that Michael did for the number of peer reviewers available, and from their own research they felt, if anything, it was easier to get a peer, because they're in a hot subject with lots of young researchers, it's easier to find someone to review a paper than 5 years ago. So, I think, but we've really got to look after these, and the new systems we have now for online peer review are great. I peer review for one of our journals, and you can do it on the train from Oxford to London. You can, just with your little handheld computer, you can peer review a paper and feed in your comments. It's fantastic.
Last year, you published your latest book
Yes.
about publishing, academic and professional publishing for Chandos, which makes you now an editor and author of Elsevier.
They haven't written a welcoming letter. I don't know if there's anyone from Elsevier. Yes. I see. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Do you see the coming life changes stimulating more of this, or are you going to spend your days fly fishing?
Well, I have talked to Ian about 1 or 2 ideas, and Ed and Ian and I have talked to the publisher about various ideas. So we're still brewing something. But when I managed to retire, I set up a trust, conservation trust, which has somehow attracted a lot of funding. So I've got to deliver on that, and another program starting in November, another idea in conservation. And then I'm starting a forest school. I don't know if you know this concept of a forest school, but kids are going to come out from the local primary school 1 morning a week, and then another age class another morning, and have their classes actually in our woods, and be taught a bit about nature, but also get some standard classes, but just sitting out in the woods rather than behind screens, or front of screens, should I say. So I'm trying there's some other things I want to do as well as publishing.
Well, thank you, Bob, very much for sharing all your thoughts with us today.